London 1892, the season every debutante dreamed of, and one girl feared most. The laughter stopped the moment she entered the room. It was not loud enough to echo, yet sharp enough to slice through the air, that kind of silence which follows pity disguised as politeness. Lady Evelina Whitmore knew it well. Every glance held sympathy or curiosity, never warmth. They stared at her as though she were a portrait, framed in misfortune, painted in compliance. She had not been born for such a gaze, yet she bore it with the grace her governess had once called her only weapon. Today that grace was all she had left. The marriage contract had been signed a fortnight ago, sealed by families who valued titles more than tenderness. The Duke of Ravenshade, her intended, had agreed to the arrangement with the same detachment with which one accepts an unavoidable sentence. It was said he had not smiled since his father's death 3 winters past. It was also said, whispered, always whispered, that he could give no heir. And though Evelina did not care for gossip, she could not help but hear the quiet venom of society's words. Poor girl. Married to a name, not a man. The wedding morning was gray. Not the gentle gray of rain, but the kind that dulled gold into tin and roses into wilted flesh. Evelina's gown, though made of silk, felt like armor, her veil a shroud. She stood before the altar at St. Clement's Chapel, her gloved hands trembling beneath the weight of pearls her mother had insisted upon, heirlooms meant to remind her of duty. The Duke arrived precisely on time, tall, composed, and unreadable. His dark coat bore no flower, no sign of joy. When their vows were spoken, his voice did not falter, but neither did it soften. I take thee, Evelina Whitmore, to be my lawful wife. The words felt like scripture drained of spirit. She repeated them in turn, her tone gentle, steady, an act of courage mistaken for compliance. The congregation watched, murmuring approval at her poise, yet she saw how their eyes flicked toward him, assessing, doubting. After the ceremony, London's elite gathered for the reception at Ravenshade Hall, a mansion grand in architecture yet cold in soul. Chandeliers burned bright, but their light fell upon faces eager for amusement, not blessing. Evelina moved through the crowd like a ghost stitched into silk. She smiled when spoken to, curtsied when required, and nodded through every whispered condolence disguised as congratulations. One lady, powdered and perfumed to conceal age and malice alike, leaned close and murmured, "You are brave, my dear, to marry a man burdened by such limitations." Her fan fluttered like a knife disguised as lace. Evelina replied softly, "Perhaps love is not the only legacy one might leave." The lady blinked, uncertain whether she had been complimented or dismissed. From across the ballroom, the Duke watched her, his expression unreadable, his glass of claret untouched. There was a distance in him that was not pride but exile, as though he lived behind some invisible wall of his own making. When their eyes met, only briefly, Evelina felt the faintest ache of recognition, the loneliness of two people imprisoned by expectation. As the evening waned, the orchestra played a waltz. Guests urged the newlyweds to dance, but the Duke declined, claiming fatigue. The refusal rippled through the room like a dropped goblet, quiet, shocking, irretrievable. Evelina stood alone by the window, the moon pale against the frost-bitten glass. Behind her, conversations resumed, tinged with pity. She'll bear the weight of his shame now. The poor thing. Her father approached, his tone brisk. You've done well, Evelina. Ravenshade is a name worth every sacrifice. She nodded, though the words lodged in her throat like stones. She had given her obedience, her future, and perhaps her heart, all in exchange for a title whispered with both reverence and ridicule. When at last the carriages rolled away and the house grew quiet, she found herself standing at the foot of the grand staircase beside her husband. The air smelled faintly of extinguished candles and fading roses. He looked at her, not unkindly, but with the weary courtesy of a man offering gratitude at a graveside. You must be tired, he said. A little, she answered. He hesitated, as though searching for words long forgotten. I will see that your chambers are made comfortable. The east wing offers a better view of the gardens. The east wing, she repeated, her voice steady but soft. It is quieter, he replied, and the pause between them said more than either dared. She inclined her head. Then I shall rest well. He bowed slightly, not as a husband but as a host. Then he turned and ascended the staircase, his footsteps fading into the corridor's hush. When she reached her chamber, Evelina dismissed her maid and stood before the mirror. The reflection that met her gaze was not that of a bride, but of a woman on the edge of a new kind of solitude. She unpinned her hair, each curl falling like the hour's last chime, and whispered to the empty room, "So this is love's quiet grave. Outside, snow began to fall, slow and deliberate, blanketing the gardens that stretched toward the frozen river. The manor seemed to sigh, its windows glowing faintly like eyes refusing sleep. She drew the curtains and lay upon the bed, the silence pressing close. Somewhere within the house, a door closed, firm, final. Yet beneath that stillness, something faint stirred. Perhaps it was hope, faint as a candle guttering against wind. Perhaps it was merely the sound of her own heart, refusing to yield to despair. She thought of the Duke's eyes, distant, yet shadowed with something that resembled sorrow. And she wondered, not for the first time, whether cruelty always wore the face of indifference, or if sometimes it was the mask of grief. The clock struck midnight. A new life had begun, though neither of them yet knew it. In the quiet halls of Ravenshade, the past seemed to linger like breath upon glass, cold, fleeting, impossible to hold. Evelina closed her eyes, listening to the snow. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that beyond the stillness of duty, something human might yet grow. Not affection, perhaps not even understanding, but the smallest seed of possibility. Down the corridor, the Duke stood before his own fire, his hand resting upon the mantel. The flames caught the edge of his profile, revealing a man both regal and haunted. He removed his wedding ring, stared at it for a long moment, then set it upon the marble. "Forgive me," he murmured to no one. Outside the storm thickened. The firelight dimmed. And in the great house of Ravenshade, two hearts, bound by vow, divided by silence, began the slow, unseen turning toward one another as winter deepened around them. The letter arrived without a seal. No crest, no name, only the scent of lavender clinging faintly to the parchment, as though the air itself wished to disguise its contents. Lady Evelina found it upon her breakfast tray, laid carefully between a folded napkin and a silver spoon. She read it once, then again, her pulse quickening with each line. The words were cruel, written in an elegant but venomous hand. A barren duke, a beautiful fool. What irony that Ravenshade's line should end with a Whitmore. She folded the letter neatly, set it aside, and lifted her tea with steady hands. The cup did not tremble, though her heart did. Outside, the manor was waking to spring. Morning light stretched timidly through the frost-clouded windows, brushing against tapestries long dulled by grief. The servants moved quietly, aware that joy was not a language spoken here. It had been 3 months since the wedding, and the silence between the Duke and his Duchess had grown into a presence of its own, a ghost wandering the corridors, opening no doors. Evelina had learned to fill her days with small dignities. She tended to the hothouse orchids, their fragile blooms thriving where affection could not. She read aloud to the housekeeper's ailing daughter, her voice soft as rain on glass. And every evening she left a single candle burning in the west corridor, though no one ever passed that way. The Duke, she knew, often walked alone in the gardens after dusk, yet he never crossed her path. Rumor, however, was less polite. The London papers whispered of Ravenshade's marriage of courtesy, of a union born from obligation, not desire. Each week brought a fresh sting of speculation, and though Evelina never spoke of it, the servants carried the burden for her. Lowered eyes, tight lips, loyalty measured in silence. One afternoon, while arranging lilies in the drawing room, she heard the distinct rhythm of boots upon marble. The Duke seldom entered during daylight, yet there he was, tall, severe, his presence commanding without effort. He paused at the threshold as though uncertain whether he was welcome. "You have a gift for bringing life to this place," he said at last. She turned, startled by the gentleness in his tone. "It is kind of you to say so, Your Grace. The manor has such beauty, it only needed light." He regarded her a moment longer than propriety allowed. "Light?" he echoed softly. "A rare thing here." For a heartbeat she thought he might smile. He did not. But when he left, she found something on the table where he had stood, a small velvet box tied with silver thread. Inside lay a locket of polished silver, engraved with the Ravenshade crest, a falcon encircled by ivy. It was exquisite, impossibly personal. She closed her hand around it, her chest tightening with an emotion she dared not name. That night she wore it. Not for vanity, but as if to test the weight of sentiment she was unaccustomed to. The mirror caught her reflection, a woman neither triumphant nor defeated, only changed in some imperceptible way. But kindness in their world rarely went unpunished. Within days whispers began anew. Lady Penrose, with her painted smile and endless appetite for scandal, declared over tea that the Duke's barren sorrow has turned to sentiment, poor man, playing at romance to quiet his shame. Others laughed, and the laughter spread faster than truth ever could. By the week's end, London was certain the Duchess had been gifted trinkets as consolation for a loveless bed. When the rumor reached Ravenshade, Evelina said nothing. She simply took her horse and rode until the wind drowned every cruel word. Yet upon her return she found him waiting in the courtyard. The Duke stood beside the stone fountain, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes unreadable. "I imagine you've heard what they're saying," he began. "I have," she replied. "But their voices cannot wound me unless I grant them power." He studied her as though seeing her for the first time. "You speak of strength as though it were armor." "Because it must be," she said quietly. "For women in our world, armor is not forged of steel but of silence." Something flickered in his gaze, admiration perhaps or sorrow. "They judge me for what I cannot give," he murmured. "And you for standing beside me regardless." Evelina hesitated, then spoke with careful honesty. "I did not marry for pity, your grace, nor for society's approval. I married because duty demanded it. But duty does not forbid kindness." The air between them shifted, not warm, not cold, but alive. That evening the household seemed to breathe differently. The Duke dined beside her for the first time in months. Conversation, halting at first, began to flow like cautious spring water over stones. He asked about her days, she asked about the estate's affairs. He listened, truly listened, and when he spoke his voice lost its habitual chill. Later, as she prepared to retire, she found herself pausing outside the study door. Through the crack she saw him seated at his desk, pen unmoving, staring into the fire. For the first time she noticed the loneliness in his posture, a quiet surrender that years of decorum had failed to hide. She wished to speak, to thank him for the locket, for the smallest kindness of his company. Yet something held her still, that fragile fear of shattering a peace newly born. The next morning a messenger arrived from London, breathless and pale. Another letter. The Duke opened it in silence, his jaw tightening. Evelina waited, patient as he read. At last he folded the page with surgical precision and said, "They accuse you now." "Of what?" "Of deceit. That you wed me for sympathy, to inherit what you could never earn." The words struck harder than the winter wind that battered the windows. She stood, every line of her body poised between pain and dignity. "Do you believe them?" she asked. He looked at her, truly looked. "No," he said quietly. "But I fear the world might." It was not accusation but confession. She saw it then, the depth of his shame, the wound that never healed. The world had judged him barren and in doing so, stripped him of manhood. Her silence in that moment became an offering, not of submission but of mercy. "I will endure it," she whispered, "as I have endured worse." He exhaled, long and low, as though those words had freed him from something unseen. "You should not have to." When he turned away, the candlelight caught the faintest tremor in his hands. Evelina watched, her throat aching. That night, she placed the locket upon her bedside table, unable to bear its weight. Yet as she lay awake, she realized that something within her had shifted, not toward despair but toward understanding. The Duke's cruelty had never been malice, it was fear. Fear of hope. Fear that kindness might unmask him. The house slept but she did not. The rain began to fall against the windows, soft and steady, as though the sky itself mourned with her. Down the corridor, she heard his footsteps pause outside her door. He did not knock. He waited, perhaps listening, perhaps deciding. And then, just as she held her breath, he walked away. Still, the echo of that hesitation remained, fragile, human, almost tender. Evelina closed her eyes and let it linger, knowing that sometimes, the softest sound can herald a storm of the heart yet to come. The storm arrived without warning. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of iron, and the first crack of thunder rolled through Ravenshade like an accusation. Lady Evelina stood in the corridor, her candle trembling in its holder, as wind clawed at the windows and rain began to hammer against the glass. The servants hurried to fasten shutters, their whispers sharp with unease. It was not merely the weather that unsettled the house, it was what storms often brought, truth stripped of pretense. The Duke had not returned from his estate ride that afternoon. The hours bled into darkness, and still there was no sound of hooves in the courtyard. Evelina paced before the hearth, her gown brushing against the cold stone floor, the locket at her throat heavy with unsaid prayers. When at last the great doors burst open, she turned, and there he was, drenched, his coat torn, his gloves stained with mud. He looked less like a lord and more like a man who had wrestled with the wind itself. "You should not have gone out," she said, rushing forward despite herself. He removed his gloves, his expression unreadable. "The river flooded near the southern bridge. I could not leave the men to face it alone. Then let them believe their duke still values his life, she replied, her voice shaking not with anger but fear. He looked at her then, truly looked, rain glistening on his hair, his eyes shadowed yet alive. Do you, he asked softly, value it? The question struck her breathless. You speak as though I were indifferent to loss. He moved closer, the firelight flickering between them. You have every reason to be. I've given you little to keep, less to hope for. She held his gaze, unwilling to retreat. And yet I hoped still. Something shifted. A silence so profound it seemed to pulse between them. The storm outside screamed against the walls, but within that room, a different tempest gathered. He turned away first, walking to the hearth, his hand tightening on the mantle. You cannot understand, he said, what it is to live beneath rumor so long it becomes your name. To hear your worth reduced to what your blood cannot provide. I understand more than you think, she whispered. I too am spoken of. Pitted, mocked, measured by a future not yet lived. Her voice broke, not from weakness but from the unbearable honesty of it. But I did not marry a reputation, your grace. I married a man. If you will not let me see him, then all I am to you is pity returned. He turned then sharply as though struck. You would not like what you saw. I already do, she said. For a heartbeat neither moved. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the distance between them seemed suddenly fragile. Then slowly he stepped toward her. His eyes, once cold, now burned with something raw, not passion but recognition. Evelina, he said, her name almost a prayer. She had never heard her name spoken like that, not as a formality but as a confession. Her breath caught. He reached for her hand. His touch was hesitant, reverent, as though he feared she might vanish beneath it. She did not. Instead, she lifted her other hand to his cheek, an act of courage disguised as tenderness. You mistake your silence for penance, she said softly. But it is only loneliness wearing a crown. His lips parted, an answer forming but never found. The world outside raged on, yet the space between them held a stillness that felt eternal. Then, a shudder of thunder, a candle extinguished. Darkness. Evelina did not flinch. You hide behind walls built of duty and shame. I will not spend my life knocking upon them. And if I open the door? He asked, voice low. Then I will walk through. The simplicity of her answer seemed to undo him. He bowed his head, and for the first time she saw the man stripped of title, of pride, of all the defenses the world had forced him to build. His hand tightened around hers, desperate, human. When he spoke again it was barely a whisper. The physicians were wrong. Her breath caught. What do you mean? I have lived beneath their judgment so long I began to believe it. But it was not certainty, only assumption. They said I could never. He broke off, the words too heavy. I let their cruelty define me. She drew closer, the firelight flickering across their faces. And now? He looked at her, not as a duke, but as a man standing before the only truth he feared. Now, I find I wish they were mistaken. The storm outside deepened. Lightning flared, throwing shadows across the room like restless spirits. And in that brief illumination, the distance between them disappeared. Their foreheads met. No kiss, no declaration. Only the quiet surrender of two souls who had been circling one another too long. His breath trembled against her skin, and her hand found its place against his chest, where his heart beat fast, defiant, alive. When the thunder subsided, he stepped back as though startled by his own courage. Forgive me, he murmured. For what? She asked. For wishing, he said. Evelina's eyes softened. Then let us both be guilty. The words hung in the air, fragile and luminous. She turned toward the window, rain streaked the glass like tears. Behind her, the Duke remained motionless, the fire painting his silhouette in gold and shadow. Neither spoke again that night. Yet when he left the room, his footsteps no longer echoed as they once had. They moved slowly as though the weight he carried had shifted, not gone but no longer crushing. Evelina stood by the window long after, her hand resting upon the cold pane. She could still feel the echo of his heartbeat beneath her palm, still hear the unspoken words that lingered in the air. The storm had not broken the house, it had only broken the silence. When morning came, the sky was washed pale, the air heavy with the scent of rain and earth. She descended to the garden, the ground soft beneath her slippers, and saw him there, the Duke of Ravenshade, walking among the drenched roses. He turned when he heard her approach, a faint smile touching his mouth, uncertain but real. For the first time he did not bow. He simply said, You should not walk barefoot after a storm. And you should not face it alone, she replied. He hesitated, then extended his arm. She took it. They walked in silence, side by side, their steps leaving twin prints in the wet earth, fragile proof of something new, something living. Yet as the clouds thinned and the sun struggled to emerge, a single question lingered in her mind. If hope could be born in such ruin, how long before the world tried to crush it once more? The answer, she feared, would not be kind. The letter arrived on a morning too quiet to be trusted. It bore the royal seal, crimson wax pressed with the insignia of the crown, and the butler's trembling hands betrayed the weight it carried before a single word was read. Lady Evelina sat at the breakfast table, the delicate porcelain cup untouched before her. The Duke, pale beneath the light that filtered through the tall windows, took the letter without a word. The silver knife he held moments before clattered softly against the plate, its sound impossibly final. He broke the seal, eyes scanning the parchment. Whatever color remained in his face drained at once. "It's from London," he said finally, voice hollow. "They request my presence before the lords." Evelina's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "For what reason?" "They've heard rumors," he said, still reading though the words seemed to strike like blows. "Whispers that Ravenshade's line may not continue, that the estate may pass to a distant cousin should no heir be proven." He paused. "They wish to question the legitimacy of my title." The air grew thin. It was not simply a summons, it was an accusation dressed in velvet. Evelina rose slowly, crossing the room to stand beside him. "And what will you tell them?" "The truth," he said. But the truth was the very thing that had imprisoned him for years. In the days that followed, Ravenshade became a house of ghosts. Servants spoke in hushed tones, aware that any misstep could be seized as scandal. The Duke retreated into his study, drafting replies, seeking documents, consulting with men whose loyalty was measured by coin rather than faith. Evelina watched him from the shadows of corridors, her heart aching at the sight, not of a proud nobleman but of a man unraveling. One evening she entered the study unannounced. The fire had burned low, and he sat slumped over his desk, a half-empty glass beside a letter never finished. "You should rest," she said softly. He didn't look up. "Rest is for those who can afford to sleep without consequence. You cannot fight them with ink alone," she said, stepping closer. His laughter, low, bitter, filled the dim room. "What would you have me do, Evelina? Stand before Parliament and tell them that the gossip is wrong? That I, who could never give my wife an heir, might one day prove them all liars? They would laugh until their throats bled." She reached for the letter, her hand brushing his. "Then let them laugh," she said. "Their scorn cannot undo what is true." He lifted his gaze to hers, weary but searching. "And what is true, my lady?" She hesitated, the moment stretched, fragile as glass. "That I am with child," she said. For a heartbeat, neither breathed. The words hung in the air like the toll of a bell. He rose so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "Do not jest about such things." "I would not," she whispered. Her hand trembled as she touched her abdomen. "It has been nearly 6 weeks since that night." The Duke's eyes darkened with disbelief and something more dangerous, hope. He took a step forward, then another, until he stood so near she could feel the unsteady rhythm of his breath. "Evelina," he murmured as though saying her name might make the world steadier. "Do you know what you're saying?" "I know only that my heart hasn't been my own since that night," she said. "And now, neither is my body." He reached for her hand, gripping it as though it anchored him to life itself. "If what you say is true." "It is true." Her voice trembled but did not falter. "I have spoken to the physician in confidence. The signs are certain." He sank back into his chair, a hand covering his mouth, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years he could not summon words. The weight that had chained him, that cruel decree of impossibility, shattered in an instant. But relief came not as joy. It came as fear. "Evelina," he said quietly, "if word spreads before it is time, they will tear you apart. They will call you a liar, a temptress, a fraud who dared claim the impossible. I care nothing for their words," she said. "Only for yours." He looked at her then, truly saw her, and in her eyes he found something unyielding. He rose, crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Then by all that I am," he whispered, "you have given me back my life." The rain had begun again outside, steady and soft, as though the heavens themselves exhaled. He drew her close, resting his forehead against hers. For that single, perfect moment the world was still. But peace in Ravenshade never lingered long. The next morning the physician's carriage arrived before dawn, not summoned by her but by someone else. The duchess's maid, fearing for her mistress's health, had spoken in confidence to another servant, who had carried the tale further. By mid-morning the rumor had reached the estate's steward, and beyond him the duke's cousin Lord Haversham, the very man who stood to inherit Ravenshade should the duke's line fail. Haversham arrived before noon. His smile was sharp as frost. "My dear cousin," he said upon entering the study, "London will be very interested to hear of your miraculous fortune." The duke stood rigid, his hands behind his back. "You will not speak of my wife in such a tone." "Oh, I mean no insult," Haversham said smoothly. "Only curiosity. One cannot help but wonder, after all these years of certainty, how such divine providence might occur." Evelina, standing by the window, turned. "Perhaps you should wonder in silence, my lord." Haversham's eyes gleamed with venomous amusement. "Careful, Duchess. The walls have ears, and the crown has little patience for miracles unproven." He left soon after, his laughter echoing through the hall like a curse. That night, the duke paced before the fire while Evelina sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He will go to London," the duke said. "He'll twist this into scandal before the ink of my summons has dried." "Then we go first," she said. He stopped. "What?" "You said the truth would save us. Then let us carry it to them before lies can fester." His eyes burned with equal parts awe and terror. "Evelina, do you understand what it means to stand before them? They will strip you of dignity to test your word. They will call you wicked, faithless." "Let them," she interrupted, rising. "I have lived in their shadow long enough. I would rather be broken in truth than safe in silence." He stared at her, then reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it found hers. "You would face the crown for me?" "No," she said. "For us." The wind pressed against the windows again, and in its echo there was something like fate, not gentle but certain. By dawn the carriage was prepared. Ravenshade Manor loomed behind them, its towers vanishing into the mist as they set off toward London. Evelina held the duke's hand, her other resting protectively over her heart. Neither spoke. The road ahead was long, and the city waited with judgment sharpened and ready. But as the first light touched the horizon, the duke turned to her and whispered almost to himself, "They said I could never give an heir, yet you carry not only my child but my hope." And though Evelina did not answer, her fingers tightened around his, a silent vow that no power, not even the crown, would take this truth from them. The verdict came at dawn. Bells tolled in Westminster as if to announce both birth and burial, of truth, of reputation, perhaps of something far greater. The Duke of Ravenshade stood before the lords, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady, while the whispers of London's most poisonous tongues coiled through the chamber. Across the room, Lady Evelina sat cloaked in pale blue, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a study in calm defiance. The Queen's physician had been summoned, and the air trembled with expectation. Lord Haversham, ever serpentine in his civility, rose to speak first. "Your Majesties," he began smoothly, "my cousin has been the victim of unfortunate gossip, yes, yet the matter before us is not idle chatter but a question of lineage. Ravenshade's estate cannot fall to false heirs. We must be certain that this miraculous conception bears the mark of legitimacy." A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. Evelina's throat tightened, but she met his gaze unflinching. Across the distance the Duke's eyes found hers, a silent vow that no accusation would undo them. The physician approached, bowing before the assembly. "Your Graces," he said, "I can confirm the Duchess is indeed with child." His words struck like thunder, echoing through the chamber, cutting through every whisper. But before the air could settle, Haversham's voice rose again. "With child perhaps," he said coldly, "but whose?" The question was a blade meant to draw blood. A dozen nobles gasped, while others exchanged glances heavy with scandalous satisfaction. The Duke took a step forward. "You will retract that," he said, voice low and dangerous. Haversham smiled thinly. "I merely seek truth as the law demands. Is it not curious that after so many barren years, one night, and only one, brings forth such fortune?" The Duke's jaw clenched. "You dare question my wife's honor?" "I question coincidence," Haversham replied, turning toward the court. "And I believe London will do the same." The Queen's attendant raised a hand, silencing the hall. The chamber seemed to shrink, the air thickening with judgment. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Evelina rose. Her movement was graceful but resolute, her voice clear despite the storm inside her. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing slightly. if I may speak. The queen regarded her with quiet interest. You may. Evelina turned to the gathered lords, to the hungry eyes of men who weighed women like currency. You speak of coincidence, she began, as though love and life must obey the measure of men. But I have seen miracles born not of design but of mercy. The duke you question did not seek to win favor nor pity. He sought to live with dignity despite the cruelty of rumor. And in that kindness, that stillness of heart, I found faith where the world saw only failure. Her words rippled through the hall like music that refused to fade. If you call my child impossible, she continued, voice trembling only slightly, then I call him proof that even the coldest winter cannot silence spring. For a moment no one spoke. Even the queen seemed still, her gaze softened by something like memory. But Havisham, unwilling to be defeated, sneered. Poetic, my lady. Yet poetry cannot erase what science declares immutable. Evelina turned to him, eyes alight with quiet fire. Then let science bear witness. The physician who once declared the Duke barren stands before us still. Let him say whether such judgment was beyond error. The hall stirred. The old physician, pale and trembling, rose from the shadows where he had stood unseen. His voice wavered as he spoke. It is true, years ago I declared the Duke incapable of fathering an heir. But I have seen cases, rare yes but not impossible, where nature defied all certainty. Haversham's smirk faltered. You mean to tell us? I mean, the physician interrupted, that I spoke with pride, not caution. If I was mistaken, the sin is mine, not his. The hall erupted in murmurs once more. The Duke exhaled shakily as though the air had finally returned to his lungs. Evelina's gaze softened. She could see the tremor in his hand, the silent release of a burden carried too long. The queen, who had remained silent through the storm, finally spoke. Enough. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade of glass. This matter concerns not gossip, but grace. If the Almighty has chosen to bless this house despite all expectation, who among us shall question his will? She rose, her gaze fixed upon the Duke and Duchess. Let the matter rest. Ravenshade's honor stands unblemished. Evelina bowed deeply, her knees nearly giving way beneath the weight of relief. The Duke caught her hand and steadied her, his fingers entwining with hers as though to say we are whole again. The chamber, once a den of accusation, seemed suddenly smaller, no longer a cage but a witness. But outside those gilded walls, fate had not yet drawn its final breath. As they stepped from Westminster into the grey light of morning, a chill wind swept across the square. Reporters clustered like crows, their quills scratching at the promise of scandal denied. The Duke shielded Evelina with his arm as they entered the waiting carriage. Inside, silence lingered, not empty but sacred. He turned to her, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and wonder. I never imagined the day would come when I would be free of that curse. Evelina smiled faintly. You were never cursed, my love. Only tested. He reached for her hand, pressing it against his lips. And you were my salvation. The carriage rumbled forward, wheels cutting through the wet cobblestone streets. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the storm had passed, that Ravenshade's name would live on in peace. But destiny is seldom content with silence. By the time they reached the edge of the city, the Duke had grown pale. He pressed a hand to his chest, wincing as though struck by some invisible blow. Evelina's breath caught. Charles? He shook his head. It's nothing. Yet his voice was hoarse, his movements unsteady. The journey home blurred into unease, his laughter forced, his gaze distant. When at last they reached Ravenshade, he refused the physician's call. Too much fuss, he said, brushing off her worry with a ghost of his old pride. But that night, as moonlight painted the chamber in silver, Evelina woke to find him standing by the window, his hand braced against the frame. Charles, she whispered, rising. You're ill. He turned to her, the faintest smile upon his lips. If this is the price of peace, my heart pays it gladly. She crossed to him, her hands trembling as they met his. Don't speak that way. You will see our child born, you must. He looked at her then, eyes glistening with both love and apology. Promise me, he murmured, that you will tell him I was not broken, that he was born of love, not miracle. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You'll tell him yourself. He drew her close, his voice a breath against her hair. If not in life, then in legacy. And as the wind sighed against the glass, the fire flickered low, casting the shadow of two hearts bound beyond the measure of time, one fading, one fiercely beating on.